Hey guys, it's Miss Vinson. Alright, so we're going to continue our discussion about firms, and remember, every lesson brings us closer to their primary goal, which is maximizing their overall profit. Now, in our last lesson, we really looked at the underlying factor in what determines how much profit a business makes, and that's how productive their workers are. So now we're going to actually talk about some dollar values. We're going to talk about some cost. Now, we've already talked a little bit about explicit and implicit cost, but there's another way to kind of classify and categorize cost. We can split them into fixed and variable categories, just like we did with our resources. Now, fixed costs are costs whose amount stays the same no matter how much stuff you're producing. One of the best examples that I can give you for fixed cost is rent. You know how sometimes, think about a Walmart, sometimes around a Walmart, there's some of these other stores in the strip mall. Well, they have to rent out that store space in the strip mall. Now, let's say that we have a restaurant there. If we don't have any customers, can we go to the landlord this month and say, I don't think I should have to pay any rent because I didn't have any customers, I didn't make any food? That's not how it works. The landlord's just going to laugh at you. Your rent is not based on how much stuff you make or how many customers you serve. Your rent is a fixed cost. It stays the same no matter how much you're producing. On the flip side, variable costs are costs that can get more expensive or less expensive depending on what you're doing, depending on how many customers you're serving or on how much stuff you're making. So remember, I told you, when you hear the word variable, I want you to instantly start thinking labor. Labor is your ultimate variable cost. Now, why is labor a variable cost? You might be thinking, hey, you got to pay your workers a certain salary. Wouldn't that be a fixed cost? So how much you're paying in labor does fluctuate with how much stuff you're making or how many customers you're serving. Not a lot of stuff, not a lot of customers, don't need a lot of workers. Labor costs are low. Making a lot of stuff, serving a lot of customers, better have all hands on deck. Going to have a lot of workers, so your labor costs are going to be high. Now, the reason why we have to talk about these different categories is we're about to get into some of our cost terms. Now, you're going to see a similar pattern to what we did with productivity. We're going to have total cost terms, average cost terms, and a marginal cost term. Total always means how much for everything. Average is always going to mean how much for one. And then marginal is always going to be how much for one more. There are 7 cost terms, but we're going to start off with our total terms first. Now, first, let's talk about total cost. As you can expect, total cost is the overall cost to produce all of your output. So this is how much you're spending to produce everything. When we add together all of your fixed plus all of your variable, then that's going to be all of your costs. So total cost is your total fixed cost, TFC, all of your fixed cost, plus all of your variable cost, TVC. We're adding those categories together. Now you might say, well, I've never heard of TFC or TVC. Well, actually, those are our next 2 terms. We're going to take total cost and break it down into all of your fixed and all of your variable. So our next term is total fixed cost, TFC. Now, the key thing to remember about total fixed cost is it stays the same no matter how much your output level. Total fixed cost never changes. Our definition of total fixed cost is all of the fixed costs that you're paying when you produce all of your output. Our third term is total variable cost, is how much you're spending on labor to produce all of your output. So your overall total labor cost. And it's just wage, which is how much you're paying to one person, times the number of people you have, which is your labor. Now, each one of your total terms has an average counterpart. We have a pattern for all of our averages. Average is always total divided by quantity. So remember how we had total cost? Well, that's going to go with average total cost. Instead of how much it costs to produce everything, average total cost is how much it costs to make 1 unit of output. You're going to take your total cost and divide it by the number of things that you're making. And that's going to tell you how much it costs to make just one item. Now, there's another way to find average total cost. Remember how total cost was all of your fixed plus all of your variable? Well, average total cost is going to be your average fixed plus your average variable. So average total cost is how much it costs to make one thing. And we can split that into how much is going towards labor and how much is going towards fixed cost. Like when you take your car to the shop and you get the bill, a lot of times the bill will be broken down how much of that overall total bill is going towards parts and how much is going towards labor, which is probably most of it. So we're breaking it down. Our next term is average fixed cost. Average fixed cost is just total fixed cost divided by quantity. So here again, we have that same pattern. Any average is total divided by quantity. We're just keeping our similar terms together. We're keeping our fixed cost terms together. Now, average fixed cost is how much you're paying in fixed cost just to produce one unit. So this is part of that average total cost, right? Now, the thing to remember about average fixed cost is that average fixed cost always gets smaller. Well, think about what you're doing when you're averaging. You're dividing. So if we're taking average fixed cost, that means we're taking total fixed cost, which is a stationary number that doesn't change, and we're dividing it by a bigger and a bigger denominator. Finally, we get to average variable cost. This is how much you're spending on labor to make one unit. And that's our definition, how much you're spending on labor to make one unit. So again, this is the other part of average total cost. This is the labor part of the bill. You can think about it that way. Now, any average is total divided by quantity. So if we're trying to find average variable cost, then we're just going to take total variable cost and divide that by quantity. So we're going to keep our variable cost terms together. Now, finally, our last cost term is marginal cost. So notice how we had 3 total terms, we had 3 average terms, and our last one is a marginal cost. So marginal cost is how much extra it costs to produce one more unit of output. So if we're trying to figure out how much it costs to produce one more item, here's what we're going to do. Our formula is the change in total cost. So we're going to use the delta sign to represent change. Don't let that scare you. Change in total cost over the change in quantity. When you change your quantity and make one more unit, how does that change your total cost? Now, another way to find marginal cost is the change in total variable cost over the change in quantity. Now, you might say, wait, what? Let's go back to our total cost equation. Remember how total cost was all of your fixed plus all of your variable? What if your total cost goes up by $400? It's either going to be because your total fixed cost changed or because your total variable cost changed. I mean, that extra $400 had to come from somewhere, right? So it either had to come from fixed cost or variable cost. What do we know about total fixed cost? Total fixed cost never changes. And so if our total cost went up by $400, none of that $400 could have come from total fixed cost. All of it had to have come from total variable cost. So what this means, guys, is that any change in total cost is equal to the same change in total variable cost. That's how marginal cost can either be a change in TC over a change in Q or a change in TVC over a change in Q. It's going to be the same number. Also, by the way, when we do this on a graph, what are 2 things that always change by the same amount and they never get further apart and they never get closer? They're parallel. So total cost and total variable cost, since they always change by the same amount, they're always going to be parallel lines. So the best way to increase your skills with these terms and relationships is really to work with some charts. So we're keeping this chart nice and simple. Our quantity is our overall total output. That's all the stuff made by all of our workers. So it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Our next column is going to be our total fixed cost. Now this is everyone's favorite column on a chart. You know why we love total fixed cost? Total fixed cost never changes. So if you know what total fixed cost is at one quantity level, then it's the same number at all quantity levels. By the way, guys, if you have a bill to pay, even when you're producing nothing, that is always your total fixed cost. Well, you're not going to have any labor to pay when you're producing nothing because nobody's working. So if you notice that you have some money you have to pay even when your quantity is 0, that's a dead giveaway. That's always your total fixed cost, and total fixed cost never changes. Our next column is total variable cost. Now, if you had the information, you could do wage times labor and figure up your total variable cost numbers. Sometimes you may have that information. We'll work some of those charts. But for now, let me just give you the numbers. Your total variable cost, if you're making nothing, is 0. Your total variable cost from 1 unit is 5. From 2 units is 8, from 3 units is 9, from 4 units is 11, and 5 units is 15. Now that we have our total fixed and our total variable, and again, I just gave you the total variable, let's add those two categories together and get our total cost. So 10 plus 0 is 10. Notice you still have a bill to pay even if you're producing nothing. That's your rent. 10 plus 5 is going to be a total cost of 15. 10 plus 8 is going to be a total cost of 18. 10 plus 9 is 19. 10 plus 11 is 21. And 10 plus 15 is 25. Now look at the next 3 columns. The next 3 columns are all average cost. So if you're looking for average fixed cost, you want to keep your fixed cost terms together. You're going to take your total fixed cost numbers and divide them by quantity. So you're going to do 10 divided by 1, 10 divided by 2, 10 divided by 3, and so on and so forth. Notice that these numbers are always getting smaller because we're taking that total fixed cost number that never changes and we are dividing it up over more and more units of output. So average fixed cost always gets smaller. Next, we're going to do average variable cost, how much you're paying in labor just to make 1 unit. Well, any average is total divided by quantity, so average variable cost is just going to be total variable cost divided by quantity. So keep your variable cost terms together. So now we're going to take 5 divided by 1, 8 divided by 2, 9 divided by 3, and so on and so forth. Now notice that some of these numbers get into a little decimal. For instance, 11 divided by 4 is going to be 2.75. Well, these are costs, so that just means $2.75. It's just a dollar value. Notice your average variable cost. They decrease at first, and then at the end, you notice how they start to turn and go back up? They start to increase. Why would our per unit cost fall at first and then turn and start to get more expensive? It's all about our workers, right? When our workers are really, really productive at first, when they make an assembly line, then our per unit costs start to fall. But then when things get crowded and chaotic and there's too many cooks in the kitchen and the productivity falls, then the per unit costs start to skyrocket. Productivity and cost have an inverse relationship. Finally, let's look at average total cost. 2 ways you can find average total cost depending on your mathematical preferences. If you like this pattern and you're in a groove with it, then just stick with it, right? Any average is total divided by quantity, so ATC, it's just TC divided by Q. Cool, but maybe you prefer to add. Remember that average total is your average fixed plus your average variable. So notice those 2 columns, 10 plus 5 is 15, and 5 plus 4 is 9. So no matter if you use your pattern and you do average is total divided by quantity, ATC is TC divided by Q, or you just simply add together your average fixed plus your average variable, you're going to get the same thing. It just really depends on whether you prefer to use the pattern and divide or whether you like adding. Finally, we come to our marginal cost. Well, students usually get this far in the chart with really no problem, and then they hit the marginal cost column and they're like, whoa, this is the weird one. This is the one that had like those triangles in it, those delta signs, right? Marginal cost, guys, is the change in total cost over the change in quantity. It is how much extra it costs to make 1 more unit. So how do you find the change in this chart? We're literally going to look at how your total cost and your quantity columns change from row to row. So notice that when you change your quantity and make your first unit, your total cost goes from 10 to 15. So your marginal cost is an additional 5. When you make your second unit, your total cost goes from 15 to 18, so it costs an extra $3 to make that second unit. When you made your third unit, your total cost went up to 19, so that third unit cost an extra $1. When you made the fourth unit, your total cost went up to 21, so that fourth unit cost an extra 2. And when you made that fifth unit, your total cost went up to 25, so that fifth unit was an extra $4. Now that's a good intro to our cost terms. We're going to work with these a lot, and we're also going to see what these things look like on a graph. But you really definitely want to make sure you get the hang of these costs because we're going to use costs throughout the entire rest of microeconomics. I know you're going to get it. So until then, see you later.